December 29th, 1170. Canterbury Cathedral, England. Evening prayers have just begun, and the monks are singing vespers in the flickering candlelight. The cathedral is dim and cold, the way churches always are in winter, and the monks' voices echo off the stone walls in that haunting way that makes you feel small and ancient at the same time. Then the doors burst open. 4 armed men in chainmail stride into the church, swords drawn, and the singing stops. The monks scatter in terror because armed men don't belong in churches, and everyone knows what drawn swords mean. The 4 men are looking for someone specific. They're looking for Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, the second most powerful man in England, and they're here to kill him. What happens in the next 8 minutes will shock medieval England so completely that it changes the relationship between kings and subjects forever. It plants seeds that grow into Magna Carta 45 years later. It establishes limits on royal power that echo through centuries and create the legal rights you have today. But to understand why 4 knights murdered an archbishop in his own church, why the King of England locked himself in his room for 3 days when he heard the news, and why all 4 killers died horrible deaths within 4 years as if God himself was punishing them, we need to go back 15 years to when Thomas Becket and King Henry II were best friends. Because this story, this murder that changed history, starts with a friendship so close that people said they were like brothers, and it ends with one man's brains scattered on a cathedral floor, and the other man so consumed with guilt he let monks whip him at the dead man's tomb.
You need to understand something about medieval England before we go further. This wasn't a time when kings had limits. The king was the law. If the king wanted you dead, you died. If the king wanted your land, he took it. If the king was angry at you, there was no court you could appeal to, no rights you could claim, no protection you could seek except maybe from the church. And that's important, that church part, because the church was the only institution in medieval Europe that could tell kings no. Popes could excommunicate kings, which in a deeply religious age was terrifying. Bishops could refuse royal orders if those orders contradicted church law. The church had its own courts, its own laws, its own power structure that existed parallel to royal power, and this created tension. Constant tension, because kings wanted total control, and the church represented the one area where they didn't have it. Thomas Becket's story is what happens when that tension explodes. It's what happens when a king's best friend becomes his greatest enemy. It's what happens when friendship, politics, religion, and power collide and produce violence so shocking that it forces society to reconsider everything. And it all started so simply, with a young king who needed a clever administrator and found someone who was perfect for the job, someone who understood law and politics and religion, someone who was charming and brilliant and ambitious, someone who would become his best friend, and then, through a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, his murderer's target.
Before we begin this story properly, before we dive into the 15 years that led from friendship to murder, I want you to do something. If you're the kind of person who loves deep historical stories, the kind that connect past to present and show you why things you take for granted exist, hit that subscribe button. And while you're settling into your bed or your couch or wherever you're listening from, drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. I'm genuinely curious who's listening at midnight, who's waking up to this, who's winding down after a long day. Now get comfortable. Pull up those blankets. Dim whatever lights are still on. Because this story has everything. Friendship and betrayal, power and principle, rage and regret, murder and miracles, and ultimately the birth of legal limits on power that protect you today. This is the kind of story that unfolds in layers, where every piece matters, where understanding the beginning makes the ending hit harder. We're going back to 1155, to a young king with big plans and a chancellor who will help him achieve them. We're going back to before the conflict, before the anger, before the murder. We're going back to when Henry and Thomas were friends, genuinely friends, the kind of friendship that makes what comes later so much more tragic. Let's begin.
What happens next is a friendship that surprises everyone, because kings don't usually become genuine friends with their employees, but Henry and Thomas do. They hunt together, they drink together, they stay up late strategizing about how to reform England together. Henry is impulsive and temperamental, and needs someone who can calm him down and think things through. And Thomas is perfect for this. Thomas is calculating where Henry is emotional, diplomatic where Henry is blunt, patient where Henry wants everything done yesterday. They balance each other. There are stories about them finishing each other's sentences, about Henry showing up at Thomas's house unannounced for dinner, about Thomas being the only person who can tell Henry he's wrong about something without getting his head bitten off. This is real friendship, the kind where you trust someone completely, where you assume they'll always have your back, where you can't imagine them ever betraying you. For 7 years, from 1155 to 1162, they worked together to rebuild England. They restore royal justice, they tear down illegal castles, they reform the treasury, they make England functional again. And during all this time, they're also confronting what Henry sees as the biggest problem in English law. The church is above the law. In medieval England, anyone who can claim to be clergy, which includes not just priests and monks, but anyone who's received minor orders or can read Latin, is immune from royal justice. If a priest commits murder, he's tried in a church court, not a royal court, and church courts are notoriously lenient. The worst punishment a church court can give is defrocking, stripping someone of their clerical status, maybe some penance, maybe imprisonment in a monastery. But not execution, not the punishments that apply to regular people.
Henry finds this absolutely infuriating, and Thomas, as Chancellor, agrees completely. They talk about this constantly. There are documented cases, real cases, where priests committed horrible crimes and got away with slaps on the wrist. One priest murdered someone and was defrocked, and that was it. Another priest raped a woman and was sent to a monastery for a year. Henry's position is simple, and actually pretty reasonable by modern standards. Everyone should be equal before the law. If you commit a crime, you should face the same justice as anyone else, regardless of whether you're clergy or not. Law should be universal. And Thomas, as Chancellor, says, yes, absolutely, you're completely right. We should reform this. They make plans. They talk about how to approach the Pope, how to convince bishops, how to change the system from within. And then in 1162, the Archbishop of Canterbury dies. This is the most powerful church position in England. The Archbishop of Canterbury crowns kings. He runs the English church. He's essentially the religious equivalent of the king. And Henry has what he thinks is a brilliant idea. The kind of idea that seems so perfect that he can't understand why anyone would object. He decides to appoint Thomas Becket as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. His reasoning is simple. Thomas is already his best friend and most trusted advisor. Thomas agrees completely about church reform. If Thomas becomes archbishop, he can reform the church from the inside. He can make the changes that Henry wants without opposition because he'll have the authority to do it. And their friendship means they can coordinate perfectly between church and crown. It's perfect. It's foolproof. Thomas will be archbishop, they'll reform church law, and everything will be better. There's just one problem. Thomas says no. He actually tells Henry this is a bad idea. According to the sources, Thomas says something like, "If I become archbishop, I'll have to serve God first, and you second, and that will destroy our friendship." Henry doesn't listen. He's so convinced this plan is perfect that he can't hear the warning. He pressures Thomas to accept. He pressures the Pope to approve the appointment. He makes it clear that this is what's going to happen. And Thomas, perhaps because he's ambitious, perhaps because he can't say no to his king and friend, perhaps because some part of him wants this power, accepts. In June 1162, Thomas Becket was ordained as a priest on Saturday, and on Sunday he's consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury.
You read that right. He goes from layman to priest to archbishop in 2 days. Because he wasn't actually a priest before this, he was just an administrator who happened to work for the church. And then something happens that shocks everyone, especially Henry. Thomas changes completely, immediately, as if becoming archbishop flipped a switch in his personality. The man who wore fine clothes as chancellor now wears a hair shirt, which is a garment made of rough animal hair that you wear against your skin as penance, that's deliberately painful and uncomfortable, that marks you as someone devoted to suffering for God. The man who lived lavishly now lives austerely, giving his wealth to the poor. The man who agreed with Henry about everything now disagrees with him about everything. The man who said church law needed to be reformed now becomes the most aggressive defender of church rights in England. And most importantly, the man who was Henry's best friend now acts like friendship doesn't matter compared to his duty to God and church.
Henry is completely blindsided by this. He feels betrayed, which is understandable because from his perspective, his best friend just became a completely different person the moment he got the promotion Henry gave him. Have you ever seen this happen? Someone gets promoted and suddenly they're unrecognizable. They forget who their friends were, they adopt the attitudes of their new position, they act like everything before doesn't matter. That's what happened to Thomas, except more extreme because he didn't just change jobs, he changed his entire identity. As Archbishop, Thomas genuinely believes with the fervor of a convert, that his primary loyalty is to God and the church, not to the king. And this belief leads him to positions that contradict everything he said as chancellor. Henry wants to reform church courts. Thomas says absolutely not. Church courts are God's domain and kings have no authority over them. Henry wants to collect certain taxes from church land. Thomas says no, church property is sacred and immune from royal taxation. Henry wants bishops to swear loyalty to the crown. Thomas says bishops swear loyalty to God first, and any oath to the king is secondary. Every single issue where Henry expected Thomas to support him, Thomas opposes him. And it's not quiet opposition, it's loud, public, aggressive opposition that makes Henry look weak because everyone knows they used to be best friends and now Thomas is openly defying him. The conflict escalates quickly and dramatically. In January 1164, at the Council of Clarendon, Henry presented a document called the Constitutions of Clarendon that outlines his vision for church-state relations. The key provision is that clergy accused of crimes should be tried in church courts first, but if found guilty, they should be handed over to royal courts for punishment. This is Henry's compromise. Church courts can determine guilt, but punishments should be the same as for anyone else. It's actually a reasonable middle ground. Thomas refuses to sign it. He says it violates the church's ancient liberties, that it puts church under state, that he cannot in good conscience agree to it. Henry explodes. Their friendship, which was already strained, shatters completely at this moment. Henry accuses Thomas of betraying him, of lying to him for years about his beliefs, of accepting the archbishop position under false pretenses. Thomas accuses Henry of trying to destroy the church, of being a tyrant, of caring more about power than about God.
The next 6 years, from 1164 to 1170, are a slow-motion disaster. Henry strips Thomas of properties. Thomas excommunicates Henry's supporters. Henry tries to have Thomas arrested on dubious charges. Thomas flees England in 1164 and spends 6 years in exile in France, living in monasteries, writing letters to the Pope complaining about Henry, becoming increasingly rigid in his positions. Henry, meanwhile, is ruling England and getting more and more frustrated that this priest, who used to be his best friend, is making him look weak. Because here's the thing about medieval kingship: your power depends on people believing you're powerful. If one man, even an archbishop, can openly defy you and get away with it, other people start thinking they can defy you too. Barons start questioning your authority. Neighboring kings start testing your borders. Your whole power structure depends on everyone agreeing that you're in charge. And Thomas, from exile in France, is demonstrating that Henry is not fully in charge, that there are limits to his power, that the church can successfully resist him. This is intolerable to Henry. But it's also a stalemate, because Thomas has the Pope's support, at least enough support that Henry can't just crush him. And Henry can't politically afford to look like he's persecuting the church. So they're stuck. Years pass. The conflict doesn't resolve. It just festers, getting worse, with both men becoming more entrenched in their positions, both men's pride preventing compromise, both men remembering their friendship and hating each other more because of it. Betrayal by an enemy is expected. Betrayal by a friend, or what feels like betrayal, that cuts deeper than anything else.
In 1170, they finally negotiate a reconciliation of sorts. Neither man really wants it, but the Pope is pressuring them to make peace, and both of them are tired of the conflict. In December 1170, Thomas returns to England. He's been gone for 6 years. He returned to Canterbury, to his cathedral, to his position as Archbishop, and immediately, within days of returning, he does something that proves he's learned nothing about compromise and everything about stubbornness. He excommunicates 3 bishops who supported Henry during the exile, bishops who participated in a coronation ceremony that Thomas thought should have been his prerogative. This is a massive insult to Henry, a public slap in the face, right when they were supposed to be reconciling. Word reaches Henry in Normandy, France, where he's spending Christmas. It's December 25th, 1170. Henry is at a Christmas feast with his knights and nobles, celebrating, drinking, probably already in a bad mood because he's been fighting with his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his sons are starting to rebel against him, and ruling a kingdom that stretches from Scotland to southern France is exhausting. Then a messenger arrives and tells him, Thomas Becket has excommunicated your bishops. Thomas has broken the peace before it even properly began. Thomas is once again publicly defying you and making you look weak. And Henry, who has a temper that's legendary even by medieval standards, who has been patient for 6 years while Thomas opposed him from France, who thought this was finally over, loses control completely. He starts shouting at his knights about Thomas, about betrayal, about how he's fed nothing but cowards and weaklings who let a low-born clerk mock their king. The exact words he used are disputed because chroniclers give different versions, but the meaning is clear. Henry wants Thomas dealt with. Some sources say he shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Others say, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" One version has him screaming, "I wish Thomas were dead." He's drunk, he's enraged, he's venting his fury at men he thinks aren't loyal enough to him. And here's the critical thing. He's not ordering Thomas's murder. He's not saying, "Go to Canterbury and kill the archbishop." He's having a tantrum. He's expressing rage and frustration. He's saying the kind of thing people say in anger that they don't literally mean. But 4 of his knights hear him, and they decide to take him literally.
Before we continue to what those 4 knights do next, before we follow them across the English Channel and watch them prepare to commit the murder that will shock England and change history, I need you to do something if you're still with me. If this story has you hooked, if you're lying there wondering how we get from a drunken royal tantrum to murder in a cathedral to Magna Carta, hit that like button. It genuinely helps other people discover these stories, and I want to tell more of them. Drop a comment too. Tell me, have you ever said something in anger that you didn't mean? Have you ever had words you spoke lead to consequences you never intended? That's what's about to happen to Henry. His words, spoken in rage during a Christmas feast, are about to become weapons. 4 knights are about to cross the English Channel in winter, ride to Canterbury, and do something so shocking that even medieval people who were used to violence will be horrified. Thomas Becket is about to die, and he knows it's coming. The question is, will he run or will he face his killers? Let's find out. 4 knights hear Henry's rage on Christmas Day 1170, and they make a decision that will haunt England for generations.
Their names are Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Breton. They're not mindless thugs or low-born soldiers. They're nobles, landowners, men with estates and families and reputations to maintain. Fitzurse, in particular, is one of Henry's trusted household knights, the kind of man who's been with the king for years, who understands how power works. These men hear Henry's fury about Thomas Becket, and they understand, or think they understand, what Henry wants, even if you won't say it directly. They know that kings can't order murders openly, especially not murders of archbishops. They know that if something is to be done about Thomas, it needs to happen in a way that gives Henry deniability. And they know that if they succeed, if they remove this problem that's been plaguing their king for 6 years, they'll be rewarded even if Henry has to publicly condemn them. This is how power works in medieval courts. You prove your loyalty by doing the things your lord wants but can't ask for directly. So, on December 26th, the day after Christmas, these 4 knights slip away from Henry's court separately. They don't announce where they're going, they don't ask permission, they just leave, traveling in different directions initially so as not to attract attention, then meeting up on the road to the English Channel. They're going to Canterbury. They're going to confront Thomas Becket. And whether they've already decided to kill him, or whether they think they're just going to arrest him and things will escalate from there, we'll never know for certain, but they're bringing swords. The crossing from Normandy to England takes them 2 days, because winter storms make the channel dangerous and unpredictable. They land somewhere on the southeast coast of England on December 27th or 28th, and then they ride hard for Canterbury. It's maybe 50 miles from the coast to Canterbury, a full day's ride in good weather, longer in winter when the roads are muddy and the days are short. They're traveling fast, not stopping to rest properly, driven by purpose and maybe by the fear that if they slow down, if they think too much about what they're planning, they might lose their nerve. Because what they're contemplating is enormous. Thomas Becket isn't just any priest. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious authority in England, a man who reports directly to the Pope, a man whose person is supposed to be sacred. Killing him isn't just murder, it's sacrilege. It's the kind of sin that damns your soul. Medieval people believed absolutely in heaven and hell, in divine judgment, in the reality that your actions in life determine your fate after death. These knights know this. They believe it as deeply as they believe anything, and yet they're riding toward Canterbury anyway, because their loyalty to their king, their desire to prove themselves, their anger at this priest who's defied royal authority for years, all of this outweighs their fear of damnation. Or maybe they've convinced themselves that killing a traitor to the king isn't really murder, that they're serving justice, that God will understand. People are very good at justifying terrible things when they want to do them badly enough. Meanwhile, in Canterbury, Thomas Becket knows they're coming. He has friends at Henry's court, people who got word to him that something is happening, that knights have left Normandy heading toward England, that the atmosphere at Henry's Christmas feast was dangerous. Thomas has been receiving warnings for days now to hide, to flee, to leave England again and return to France where he'll be safe. His advisors, his monks, his friends, everyone is telling him the same thing. You're in danger, you need to leave, these men are coming to kill you. And Thomas refuses. He absolutely refuses to run.
There's something you need to understand about Thomas Becket in December 1170, after 6 years of exile and constant conflict with Henry. He's exhausted. He's tired of fighting. He's tired of exile. He's tired of the political maneuvering and the negotiations and the compromises that solve nothing. And somewhere in his mind, some part of him has decided that if this is going to end, it needs to end definitively. Thomas is a smart man. He understands medieval politics and medieval religion. He knows that martyrs are powerful. He knows that a living, troublesome archbishop can be pressured and negotiated with and eventually worn down, but a dead archbishop, a murdered archbishop, especially one killed in his own cathedral, that person becomes a saint. That person becomes untouchable.
That person's cause becomes sacred. And Thomas's cause, the defense of church rights against royal interference, that cause needs a martyr. Whether Thomas is consciously planning his own martyrdom, or whether he's just so stubborn that he won't run even when he should, we can't know for certain. Medieval chroniclers who wrote about this later, most of them churchmen who wanted Thomas to be a saint, portray him as deliberately seeking martyrdom, as knowing exactly what he was doing. Modern historians are more skeptical, thinking maybe Thomas just underestimated the danger or was too proud to flee again. But I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think Thomas knew he was probably going to die, and he decided that dying for the church was better than living in endless conflict, and he made his choice. So when his advisors beg him to leave Canterbury, to hide, to seek protection, he says no. When they offer to bar the cathedral doors and prepare defenses, he says absolutely not. A church must remain open to all. When they suggest he could at least stay away from the cathedral, stay in his palace where there are walls and guards, he says he'll continue his normal duties, and if God wants him to live, he'll live, and if God wants him to die, he'll die. This is either tremendous faith or tremendous stubbornness, or both. And it terrifies everyone around him because they can see what's coming, and Thomas won't let them protect him.
December 29th, 1170, dawns cold and gray in Canterbury. Thomas wakes early, as he always does, says his private prayers, dresses in his archbishop's robes. He celebrates morning mass in the cathedral, which is his duty every day. The monks who attend the service notice nothing unusual about him. He's calm, focused, performing the rituals he's performed thousands of times. After Mass, he returns to his palace, which is adjacent to the cathedral, connected by a passageway. He meets with some monks about routine business. He eats a small meal. He's going about his day as if it's a normal day, as if armed men aren't riding toward Canterbury to kill him, as if his life isn't measured in hours now. His advisors keep coming to him with updates. The knights have been sighted, they're getting closer, they're in Canterbury now, they're at the palace gates, and Thomas just nods and continues what he's doing. Around 4 in the afternoon, the 4 knights arrive at the Archbishop's palace. They're not in armor yet, they're wearing regular clothes, travel-stained from the road, but not openly threatening. They're let into the palace because they're nobles and knights, and you can't just turn away men of their rank. They're brought to the Great Hall, where Thomas is sitting with some of his household, and here's where it gets tense, where you can feel the situation spiraling toward violence. The knights don't kneel. They don't show the respect that protocol demands you show an archbishop. They stand there, angry, confrontational, and Reginald Fitzurse starts speaking. He says they've come from the king. He says Thomas must go to Winchester to answer for his crimes, must stand before the king's justice, must face the consequences of excommunicating the bishops. His tone is threatening, barely controlled. Thomas, sitting there, surrounded by his own people, but badly outnumbered by trained warriors, doesn't back down even slightly. He says no. He says he answers to God and the Pope, not to Henry. He says the bishops deserved excommunication for their actions. He says he's not going anywhere. The argument escalates. The knights get louder, more aggressive, moving closer to Thomas. Thomas's household starts getting defensive, moving between him and the knights. People are shouting now. Fitzurse accuses Thomas of treason, of betraying the king who raised him up, of being ungrateful and disloyal. Thomas accuses the knights of being Henry's thugs, of threatening a man of God in his own house, of violating every principle of Christian conduct. It's the kind of argument where both sides are so angry they're past the point of backing down, where pride and rage make compromise impossible. The knights finally break it off. They leave the hall, but they're not leaving Canterbury. They're just leaving the building, and everyone in that hall knows what's about to happen. They're going to arm themselves. They're going to come back. And when they come back, they're coming to take Thomas by force. And if he resists, they'll use violence. Thomas's advisors immediately start shouting at him, "Bar the doors, prepare the fences, send for armed men." Thomas refuses all of it. He says a church must never be closed to anyone. He says violence will not be met with violence. And then he does something that seems insane. He heads to the cathedral for evening prayers because it's almost 5 o'clock,
and evening prayers are part of his daily duty, and he's not going to skip his religious obligations because some knights are threatening him. His advisors are practically dragging him toward the cathedral, trying to get him into the church where at least the sanctity of the building might protect him, and Thomas is walking calmly as if nothing unusual is happening. They get him through the passageway from the palace to the cathedral, and now Thomas is inside Canterbury Cathedral, the most sacred building in England, standing near the altar where he stood thousands of times before. The monks are gathering for vespers, evening prayers. They're starting to sing. The cathedral is lit by candles because it's December and the sun is already set, so everything is shadows and flickering light and the sound of chanting echoing off stone walls.
The four knights spread out slightly as they enter, making sure Thomas can't escape past them, though Thomas isn't trying to escape. He's just standing there by the pillar, watching them come. Reginald Fitzurse, who seems to be the leader, calls out, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and realm?" It's a formal accusation, giving this murder a veneer of legitimacy, trying to frame this as an execution rather than an assassination. And Thomas, in what might be the bravest or most foolish moment of his life, depending on how you look at it, responds, "I am here, no traitor, but a priest of God. What do you want?" The knights close in. They're trying to drag him outside because murdering an archbishop inside a cathedral is a level of sacrilege that even they are hesitating at. If they can get him outside into the courtyard, then technically it's not desecrating the church. So they grab him, try to pull him toward the doors. Thomas is a big man, tall and strong, and he grabs the pillar he's standing next to and holds on. He won't be moved. He's shouting at them, "I am ready to die, but you will not drag me from this church. If you're going to kill me here." And here's where you see the absolute stubbornness of the man, the unwillingness to compromise, even when compromise might save his life. If Thomas had let them drag him outside, there's a chance they might have arrested him instead of killing him. But by refusing to leave the church, by forcing them to either kill him in the cathedral or give up entirely, he's making it almost impossible for them to back down. They're pulling on him, he's holding the pillar, Edward Grimm, the monk, is trying to protect him and getting in the way, and the situation is chaos and rage and desperation. Then Fitzurse makes a decision. He stops trying to pull Thomas outside. He raises his sword. And Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, former Chancellor of England, once the best friend of the king, stops struggling and says words that will be remembered for centuries. "I am ready to die for my Lord, that in my blood the church may obtain liberty and peace." The first blow hits Thomas on the head. He's still standing. The second blow cuts deeper into his skull. He falls to his knees. The third blow, struck by Richard Le Breton, kills him, opening the top of his skull. And then, in an act of desecration so shocking that chroniclers struggle to describe it, Hugh of Horsey, a clerk who accompanied the knights, puts his foot on Thomas's neck and scatters his brains across the cathedral floor, saying, "Let us go, this fellow will rise no more."
It's over. 8 minutes from when the knights entered to when Thomas Becket died. And in those 8 minutes, they committed an act that medieval England will see as so horrific, so blasphemous, so fundamentally wrong, that even people who hated Thomas will be appalled. The knights stand there for a moment in the flickering candlelight, looking at what they've done. The Archbishop of Canterbury is dead on the floor of his own cathedral, his blood and brain matter spreading across the stones, killed during evening prayers at the altar of God. Then they panic. They run. They flee the cathedral, mount their horses and ride into the night, because suddenly they understand what they've done, and they know there's no reward coming, no royal gratitude, just horror and rage and consequences. The monks slowly, carefully come back into the cathedral. They find Thomas's body by the pillar, blood pooling around his head, and they begin to pray because they don't know what else to do. Some of them start collecting his blood in vials, because already, within minutes of his death, they're thinking, this is a saint's blood, this is going to be sacred, this is going to work miracles. And they're right. But first, the news has to reach King Henry II in Normandy. The king who never wanted this, who spoke in rage but didn't mean it literally, who is about to learn that words have consequences and power has limits, and that his best friend is dead because 4 knights thought they were serving him. That news reaches Henry on New Year's Day, 1171, and when it does, Henry's world collapses. But that's the next part of our story. For now, Thomas Becket is dead, murdered in his cathedral, martyred for the church's rights against royal power, and everything is about to change.
The news travels slowly in medieval winter across stormy seas, but it travels. Word spreads from Canterbury to London, from mouth to mouth, growing more horrific with each retelling. The Archbishop has been murdered in his own cathedral during evening prayers by the king's knights. His skull was split open, his brains were scattered on the floor. 4 armed men burst into the holiest church in England and killed the holiest man in England at the altar of God. By December 30th, all of England knows. By New Year's Eve, ships brave the winter channel to carry the news to France. And on January 1st, 1171, a messenger reaches King Henry II in Normandy, where he's still at court, still celebrating the Christmas season, completely unaware that his life is about to shatter. The messenger is terrified to deliver this news, because you don't tell a medieval king that his words led to the murder of an archbishop unless you absolutely have to. But someone has to tell him. So the messenger kneels before Henry and says the words that will haunt Henry for the rest of his life. Your Grace, Thomas Becket is dead. He was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral on the 29th. 4 of your knights killed him. And Henry's reaction is immediate and total. He doesn't rage, he doesn't explode in anger. He collapses. According to multiple chroniclers who witnessed this or heard about it immediately after, Henry falls to the ground, weeping. He tears at his clothes. He covers his head with ashes. He refuses to speak. Then he locks himself in his chamber and won't come out for 3 days. For 3 days, the King of England, the most powerful man in his realm, stays in his room in complete darkness, refusing food, refusing to see anyone, making sounds that his servants describe as inhuman grief. And you might ask, why? Henry hated Thomas by this point. They'd been enemies for years. Thomas had defied him, embarrassed him, made him look weak. Shouldn't Henry be relieved that the problem is solved? But that's not how it works when you get exactly what you wanted in the worst possible way.
Henry never wanted Thomas murdered. He wanted Thomas silenced, controlled, defeated, made to submit. He wanted his old friend back. Thomas who agreed with him and supported him and made him feel like they could accomplish anything together. Or, failing that, he wanted Thomas gone, exiled again, stripped of power, neutralized as a threat. But murdered? Murdered in a cathedral by men who thought they were serving him? That's a catastrophe on every possible level. First, there's the guilt. Henry's words at that Christmas feast, spoken in drunken rage, directly caused this murder. He knows it. Everyone knows it. The 4 knights heard him express his fury at Thomas and decided to act on it. Henry can claim he didn't order it, and technically he didn't, but his words were a weapon, and the knights used that weapon to kill Thomas. That's on him. That weight, that moral responsibility, that's something Henry will carry for the rest of his life. Second, there's the political disaster. Henry needed to maintain good relations with the church and with the Pope. Murdering an archbishop makes that impossible. The Pope is going to be furious. Other bishops are going to be terrified, thinking they could be next. Christian kings across Europe are going to be horrified, maybe deciding Henry is too dangerous to deal with. Henry's entire political position is suddenly precarious because everyone is looking at him as the king who got an archbishop killed. And third, most importantly, there's the religious horror. Medieval people believed absolutely in divine judgment. They believed that God watched human actions and punished sins and rewarded virtue, and Henry has, through his knights, committed one of the worst sins imaginable, killing an archbishop in a church.
That's not just murder, that's sacrilege. That's the kind of sin that damns your soul to hell. Henry is a religious man, genuinely religious in the way medieval people were, and he's terrified that he's damned, that he's going to die and face God's judgment for this act, that he'll spend eternity in hell because he couldn't control his temper during a Christmas feast. So yes, Henry stays in his room for 3 days, and when he finally emerges, he's a changed man. He's subdued, careful, aware that he's made a mistake that can't be fixed. Thomas Becket is dead, and Henry can't bring him back, can't undo it, can't make it right.
Meanwhile, in Canterbury, something extraordinary is happening. Thomas's body has been prepared for burial. The monks cleaned his wounds, dressed him in his archbishop's robes, and laid him in a tomb in the cathedral crypt. And people are coming. Hundreds of people, then thousands, flooding into Canterbury to see the place where Thomas died, to pray at his tomb, to collect drops of his blood that the monks are distributing in small vials. And they're reporting miracles. Within days of Thomas's death, miracles. A blind woman touches a vial of Thomas's blood to her eyes and claims her sight is restored. A crippled man prays at Thomas's tomb and says he can walk. A child with a fever is brought to the cathedral and recovers instantly. Are these miracles real? Are they mass hysteria? Are they people so desperate for divine intervention that they convince themselves they've been healed? From a modern skeptical perspective, they're probably some combination of psychosomatic healing, coincidence, and deliberate fraud by people who want Thomas to become a saint. But from a medieval perspective, from the perspective of people who believed absolutely in saints and miracles and divine power, these are genuine miracles. They're proof that Thomas died a martyr, that God is vindicating him, that he's already in heaven interceding with God on behalf of people who pray to him. The miracle reports multiply rapidly. By February, there are dozens. By March, hundreds. Canterbury becomes the second most important pilgrimage site in Europe after Rome. People walk for weeks to get there. Sick people are carried there by their families hoping for healing. Nobles donate money to build a grand shrine for Thomas. The monks of Canterbury are overwhelmed by the crowds and the attention and the sudden importance of their cathedral. And everyone, absolutely everyone, is talking about how God is punishing the men who killed his archbishop.
Because the 4 knights who murdered Thomas, the 4 men who rode into that cathedral and swung their swords and ended his life, they didn't get away with it, not even close. They flee Canterbury that night and scatter, each going to his own estates, trying to figure out what to do now that they've committed the most notorious crime in England. And they discover very quickly that they're not going to be rewarded. Henry doesn't thank them. Henry doesn't protect them. Henry is too busy trying to save his own political position to shield the men who created this disaster. The knights are on their own, and they're discovering that everyone hates them. Common people spit when they see them. Priests refuse them communion. Other nobles won't associate with them because being connected to regicide, to archbishop murder, marks you as cursed. The 4 knights are social pariahs overnight, and more than that, they're terrified, because the church moves fast against them. Within weeks, the Pope excommunicates all 4 knights. Excommunication in medieval Christianity isn't just being kicked out of church, it's being cut off from God's grace. It means your soul is damned unless you repent and are reconciled. It means you can't receive sacraments, can't be buried in consecrated ground, can't enter heaven when you die. For medieval people who believed absolutely in the reality of heaven and hell, excommunication is a death sentence for your immortal soul. It's worse than execution, because execution only kills your body, but excommunication kills your soul for eternity. The 4 knights are spiritually dead, walking around in bodies that are already damned. And they know it. They feel it. They can't sleep at night. They see Thomas's face in their dreams. They hear his voice saying, "I am ready to die for my Lord." They remember the feeling of their swords cutting through his skull, the sight of his blood on the cathedral floor, the sound of the monks screaming. And they're being hunted, not just spiritually, but physically. The Pope has declared that anyone sheltering them is also excommunicated. They can't stay in England, they can't go to their estates, they have to flee, have to become wanderers, have to try to find some way to reconcile with the Church before they die.
Let me tell you what happens to each of them, because their fates are important not just for what they tell us about medieval justice, but for what medieval people believed they told us about divine justice. Reginald Fitz-Urse, who seems to have been the leader who called out, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king," who struck the first blow, he fled to Ireland. Ireland is far enough from England that maybe he can hide there, maybe find some lord who'll protect him despite the excommunication. But he can't escape what he's done. He develops some kind of wasting disease, chroniclers don't specify exactly what, that slowly destroys his body. He's in constant pain, he can't eat, he loses weight until he's skeletal. And in 1173, 3 years after murdering Thomas, Reginald Fitz-Urse dies in Ireland, alone and in agony, never having been reconciled with the Church, dying excommunicated, which means dying damned. Medieval people who heard about this said, "That's divine punishment, God struck him down." Modern people would say, "That's probably cancer or some chronic illness, and the guilt and stress certainly didn't help." Either way, he died badly, and everyone agreed he deserved it. William de Tracy goes a different route. He can't live with the guilt. He decides to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to walk to the holiest site in Christianity, to beg God for forgiveness at the place where Christ died. This is the medieval solution to terrible sins. You do penance, you suffer, you prove through your suffering that you're sorry. So William sells everything he owns, takes the money, and starts walking east. It's 1171 when he leaves England. He walks through France, through Italy, through the Byzantine Empire, through hostile Muslim territory, all the way to Jerusalem. It takes him more than a year. He reaches Jerusalem in late 1172 or early 1173. He prays at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ's tomb is supposed to be. He begs forgiveness. And then he gets sick. Jerusalem in the 12th century is not a healthy place for Europeans. The water makes you sick, the heat exhausts you, diseases spread easily. William de Tracy contracts something, probably dysentery or typhoid, and dies in Jerusalem in 1173, never making it back to England. He's buried in Jerusalem in unconsecrated ground because he's still excommunicated. Medieval people said he tried to repent, but God wouldn't forgive him. Modern people say he died of disease in an unhealthy city after a grueling journey. Either way, the guilt drove him to walk thousands of miles to die in a foreign land. Hugh de Morville tries to hide. He flees north to Scotland to his estates up there, thinking maybe Scottish law won't reach him, maybe he can live quietly and wait for this to blow away. But it doesn't blow away. The Pope pressures the Scottish king to confiscate Hugh's lands and expel him. Hugh becomes a fugitive in Scotland, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long, always afraid of being captured or killed. And the stress destroys him. He develops some kind of nervous condition that makes him shake constantly, makes him unable to sleep, and eventually makes him unable to function. In 1174, 4 years after the murder, Hugh de Morville dies in Scotland, possibly from a stroke or heart attack brought on by years of stress and fear. His estates are taken by the crown, his family loses everything. Medieval people said God pursued him even to Scotland. Modern people say a life of constant fear and guilt will kill you just as surely as disease. Richard Le Breton, the one who struck the killing blow that actually ended Thomas's life, the one who is said to have stepped on Thomas's neck and scattered his brains, he flees to Jersey, the island in the English Channel. Jersey is technically under English control, but far enough from the mainland that he hopes he'll be left alone. He's not left alone. The local bishop refused him entry to any church. People won't trade with him. He's completely isolated, living in a small house on the coast, watching the sea, waiting to die.
And in 1174, he does die, possibly by suicide, though the sources aren't clear. He's found dead in his house. Some chroniclers say he threw himself off a cliff, others say he drank poison, others say he just died of a broken heart, which is medieval code for depression or some stress-related illness. Whatever killed him, Richard Le Breton dies excommunicated, damned, alone on an island with the guilt of having killed an archbishop. 4 nights, 4 deaths, all within 4 years of the murder, all of them horrible, all of them away from home, all of them while still excommunicated and therefore damned. Medieval people looked at this pattern and saw the unmistakable hand of God. They said, Thomas Becket is a saint and God punished his killers. Modern historians look at the same pattern and see guilt, stress, exile, disease, and the fact that violent men living in the 12th century didn't have long life expectancies anyway. But regardless of interpretation, the facts are clear. The 4 men who killed Thomas Becket all died badly and quickly, and their deaths reinforced the narrative that Thomas was a martyr and his cause was holy.
And that narrative is what changes everything. Because in 1173, just 3 years after his death, Pope Alexander III officially canonizes Thomas Becket as a saint. 3 years from death to sainthood is extraordinarily fast. The usual process takes decades, requires extensive investigation of miracle claims, and demands proof of holy life. But Thomas's case is rushed through because the miracles are so numerous, because popular devotion is so strong, and because the political pressure is enormous. Thomas Becket becomes Saint Thomas Becket, patron saint of Canterbury, one of the most popular saints in medieval Europe. His shrine at Canterbury became one of the wealthiest and most visited pilgrimage sites in the world. Kings and peasants alike come to pray there. The shrine is decorated with gold and jewels donated by grateful pilgrims. Canterbury monks become wealthy from the donations. And more importantly, Thomas's death becomes the ultimate example of the Church successfully resisting royal tyranny. He died rather than submit to the king. He chose martyrdom over compromise, and God vindicated him through miracles and through the horrible deaths of his killers. This is the narrative that spreads across Europe. This is what people remember, not the political details of the conflict, not the nuances of church-state relations, but the simple story. A holy man stood up to a king, the king's men killed him, God punished the killers, and made the holy man a saint. And that story has power. That story tells everyone in medieval Europe that there are limits to royal power, that kings are not above God's law, that subjects can resist tyranny and be vindicated by God. This is dangerous. This is revolutionary. This is exactly the kind of idea that makes kings nervous. And King Henry II, who caused all of this, who spoke the words that led to Thomas's death, has to deal with the consequences. Henry spends 1171 through 1173 trying to repair his reputation. He negotiates with the Pope. He makes promises about church rights.
He agrees to compromise on many of the issues he and Thomas fought about. He's cooperative and submissive in ways he never was before because he understands that he has no choice. The murder of Thomas Becket has made Henry politically vulnerable, and he needs the Pope's support to maintain his position. But it's not enough. People still blame him. They still whisper that he ordered the murder, even though he didn't. They still think he's guilty. So in July 1174, Henry does something extraordinary. He performs public penance at Thomas's tomb. He travels to Canterbury. He walks the last mile to the cathedral barefoot, through the streets, while crowds watch. He enters the cathedral and goes to the crypt where Thomas is buried. And there, in front of witnesses, Henry strips to the waist and allows the monks of Canterbury to whip him. They strike him on his back with leather straps, not enough to seriously injure him, but enough to hurt, enough to draw blood, enough to humiliate him. Henry, King of England, submits to being beaten by monks at the tomb of the man his words killed. This is theater. This is political survival.
Henry doesn't believe that being whipped will actually absolve him of sin, but he knows that being seen to do penance, to humble himself before Thomas's sanctity, will help restore his reputation. And it works. After this public humiliation, after this demonstration of repentance, people start to forgive Henry. They say, he was wrong, but he's repented, and that's what matters. Henry's political position stabilizes. He rules for another 15 years and dies in his bed in 1189. Not a bad outcome for a man who caused an archbishop's murder. But he never escapes Thomas's shadow. For the rest of his life, Henry is remembered as the king whose words killed Becket. That's his legacy. Not his legal reforms, not his territorial conquests, but the murder of his former best friend. And the legal impact, the political impact, the historical impact of Thomas Becket's death, that's still unfolding. Because Thomas proved something that medieval people had started to forget. Kings have limits. There are things even kings can't do. There are lines even royal power can't cross. And if those limits are violated, there are consequences, not just from God, but from society, from the church, from the people who decide that some things are more important than obedience to the king.
45 years after Thomas Becket's murder, English nobles will force King John, Henry's youngest son, to sign a document called Magna Carta. That document will establish in writing that the king is subject to law, that there are rights the king cannot violate, that royal power has legal limits. And when those nobles are arguing with King John, when they're justifying their resistance to his tyranny, they remember Thomas Becket. They remember that one man stood up to a king and refused to compromise, and died for it, and was vindicated by God. They remember that the church successfully resisted royal power and forced the king to submit. They remember that Henry II, the most powerful king in Europe, was brought low by the murder of one archbishop, and they think if the church could limit the king's power, so can we. If Thomas Becket could resist, so can we. If Henry had to do penance, then John could sign a charter. Thomas Becket's death plants seeds that grow into constitutional limits on monarchy. Those limits evolve over centuries into parliamentary democracy, into rule of law, into the idea that leaders serve under law rather than above it. And all of that, the entire tradition of limited government and legal rights and constitutional democracy, all of it has roots in the moment when 4 knights burst into Canterbury Cathedral and killed an archbishop who refused to submit to his king. That's what we'll explore in Part 2. How Thomas Becket's martyrdom inspired Magna Carta. How Magna Carta evolved into modern democracy. How the murder you just heard about connects directly to the legal rights you have today. To the idea that no one, not even the most powerful person in a society, is above the law. That's the legacy of December 29th, 1170. That's why this execution changed everything. But for now, for tonight, as you're lying there comfortable and safe under the rule of law in a society where leaders can't have you killed on a whim, remember that people died to create that safety. Remember Thomas Becket, who chose principle over survival. Remember that sometimes the worst moments in history create the best outcomes. And sleep well, knowing that the rights you have, the legal protections you enjoy, they didn't come easily. They came through centuries of struggle and sacrifice, and they're worth remembering, worth appreciating, worth protecting. Good night.